Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Attorney General Pam Bondi gets into yelling match with Rep. Balint, posted by Dr. Who 07, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, if I don't really care for all the yelling matches of politics, but ultimately, if anyone wants to yell at anyone else in politics, that people are going to justify. I personally don't really care for Pam Bondi though, because I think she is very much a tool of the ruling class, especially in regards to the censorship of the Epstein files and how they'll never hold anyone accountable for them. But ultimately, I think that's going to be pretty much any uniparty attorney general, regardless of which branch of the uniparty they serve. Reddit only doesn't care for Pam Bondi because she has an R next to her name. If she had a D next to her name, Reddit would make every excuse for her in the book. It's pretty much the same with any politician, although you do occasionally run into a politician with a D next to their name that Reddit doesn't like John Fetterman, but that's much of the exception rather than the rule. The general rule is if they have an R next to their name, Reddit will go after them as hard as they can. Well, if they have a D next to their name, Reddit will always find an excuse. Unless of course they outgroup them anyway, like with John Fetterman. Even then, Reddit will still probably defend him for a chunk of the time, just since he has a D next to his name. Ultimately, I personally think people should care more about what the actual proceedings rather than what letter people have next to the name. But that's very much not how politics works. But politics isn't. A lot of people don't really have any values or principles. They just have teams, and that's very much how politics works, especially these days, I would say. Next, we have Rand Paul. It is startling, the limited government philosophy of being completely and almost entirely gutted by fidelity to a person, not ideas, tariffs or taxes, and now Republicans are the party of taxes, taxes everywhere, posted by B. Hart Hari, and that's cross-post from the We the Fifth subreddit. And I would agree with that, just because tariffs might be well-intentioned and encourage people to buy local, that doesn't mean they aren't taxes. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods, and I think, if people do want to if the governments do want to justify enforcing them, governments can justify enforcing whatever they want, but they're inherently anti-free market. I personally do think people should support their local economy rather than buying cheaper foreign goods. But if people want to justify buying cheaper foreign goods, I think they should be able to as well, and not have the government charge excess money for them for no reason other than protectionist economics. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have She Didn't Answer Anything. Massey sounds off on Bondi. Epstein files after fiery hearing clash, from YouTube.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Thomas Massey subreddit. And that looks like a YouTube video from Forbes breaking news of the exact same title. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for a lot of people in Congress, but Thomas Massey's probably one of the few good ones. I definitely do think, his quest to hold the Epstein sex trafficking ring accountable is very noble. And yeah, personally, I don't know how much longer he's going to last, because, he always seems to justify taking as principal route as he possibly can, and that's why I think his first wife probably just magically dropped dead. That's, I don't know if that has something to do with Israel Epstein, but you never know, especially these days. So, yeah, personally, I hope Thomas Massey keeps going for as long as he can. I definitely wouldn't be surprised if they try and off him soon, though, especially since, he seems to be one of the few people in D.C. currently who's not really part of the uniparty establishment. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have House passes Save America Act, sending Trump-backed election bill to the Senate, from NBCNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, of course, Reddit's going to be anti the Save America Act, because the Orange Man's one's post saying it. But because it's apparently it's about needing an ID to vote or something. And I think the libertarian perspective is, we shouldn't be having forced selectivist elections in the first place. Especially because whenever one of the parties loses the election, they're just going to call it rigged. Ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is, is, we should only have elections among voluntary collectives rather than forced collectives. I guess you could argue that every country could be considered a voluntary collective, but because you're free to move to any other country if you want to. But that being said, ultimately, when something's on the on a country scale instead of a local or community scale, it's very hard for everyone to consent to their current livelihood. And I think the libertarian position is, if we do have elections, we should at least have them be open ballot, because I don't think people should at least be open about who they're voting for and willing to defend why they voted for them and all that. Right now, under secret ballot, you can just scribble anything in, and you can proceed to lie about who you voted for and everything. And I don't think that's very libertarian. But personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, we shouldn't have any elections in the first place, as I said earlier. But if we do have to have elections, I do think they probably should be open ballot, so people could be at least held accountable for who they voted for. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration unveils coal mascot Coley from MSN.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. government should be unveiling mascots or subsidizing coal, but ultimately the U.S. government can justify doing whatever it wants to most of the time, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. If people want to use coal, I think that's fine, but I don't think it should be government subsidized, just like any other energy source. Next, we have Senate panel advances bill that shields police surveillance cameras from public scrutiny from azmirror.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, but one thing Payne didn't mention during the committee hearing is that his legislation snuffs out public scrutiny of how license plate readers are used in Arizona by using all ALPR data from public records. The bill states that any captured plate data is not subject to public review or a public records request. Instead, any data captured by LPR cameras can only be viewed by law enforcement or subpoena. And yeah, personally, I do think the government should be as transparent as possible. And so I definitely would disagree with this. But that being said, ultimately government transparency might not always benefit your cause. I remember the left for years, they wanted cameras. I forgot what they're called, kind of like GoPro cameras on police officers so they could be held accountable for what they did. And then they put the GoPro cameras on the police officers, and suddenly, it shows how they're justified a lot of the time in shooting in self-defense. And that just goes to show you that, ultimately I think the libertarian perspective is, the government should be as transparent as possible. But that being said, just because the government is transparent doesn't mean they'll always uphold the narratives that you seek to put out there. Next, we have any good YouTube channels explaining libertarian philosophy, posted by Be Her H On. And they said, I can find anti-libertarian, alt-right channels. Can anyone recommend good YouTube channels explaining libertarian philosophy? And yeah, personally, libertarianism, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Ultimately, I would say the libertarian position is, if you want to market your channel as libertarian, I think you should be able to. But that being said, the libertarian position is, ultimately each libertarian should judge libertarianism based on what they think it is. Libertarians don't believe enforcing stuff on other people, and that includes however people define libertarianism. I would say. I do think gatekeeping does have a place in libertarianism. You don't want just Stalinists taking over libertarianism and the Libertarian Party, for instance. But, ultimately, libertarianism, as I said, is going to mean different things to different people. And, if Stalinists do want to justify saying that they're libertarian, I personally would disagree with that. But, that you're just about to justify, and I can't do anything about that. So, ultimately, and that's very much the libertarian worldview. People are going to justify what they justify regardless of the system of government in place. Next, we have Whiskey Pete declares mentioning the law is sedition and wastes more tax dollars trying to intimidate political opponents, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's crosspost from the Green Round News subreddit, and that's a tweet from Pete Hegseth, quote tweeting the New York Post, who tweeted, Pentagon can't dock Senator Mark Kelly's rank, pay over illegal orders, federal judge rules, and then he replied, this will be immediately appealed, sedition is sedition, quote unquote captain. And yeah, personally, if people do want to say disobey illegal orders, people are going to say whatever they feel like. But ultimately, when you're in a position of government authority, people might not like what you have to say and sue you over it. and that's just how ultimately I think the libertarian position is we shouldn't have any figures in government authority. Having figures in government authority means that they're going to inherently act in their own self-interest, as we're seeing here. People are, if someone says something wrong, they'll use the full extent of the law to go after you, and I don't think that's very libertarian. I think the libertarian perspective is, the legal system is always going to be biased. So ultimately, I think the only way to get to an unbiased legal system is to just have no centralized legal system. I guess you could argue that's kind of anarchist, but ultimately I think libertarian, maybe you could argue small community-based legal systems rather than one large national legal system. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have former presidential candidate Ron Paul. His prediction in 2002 about the U.S. debt, Israel, Palestine, gold is frighteningly accurate. In parentheses, Ben Shapiro hated him, so he must be a good person. Posted by Apollo Delphi, and that's cross was from the Live News 24H subreddit, and that looks like a YouTube video from Tucker Carlson. Ron Paul's warnings entitled "Ron Paul's warnings have come true: rising debt, endless war, and economic collapse." And yeah, I personally would agree with Ron Paul on a lot. Libertarians don't tend to idolize a lot of people, but I definitely do think Ron Paul is someone who's been correct on a lot of stuff and has been correct on a lot of stuff for years. In some ways, I think it's probably for the best he never got the presidency, because once you get the presidency, it kind of sullies your reputation in the long term when you have to actively have to back up your politics and political agenda with the force of the state. And I definitely do think, when it comes to the presidency, it's inherently kind of a corrupt institution that's inherently kind of, I would say, more a figurehead than anything else. I think if Paul did get to the presidency and did try and actually start enacting libertarian reform, I think the deep state would probably just take him out like they probably going to do to Thomas Massie sooner rather than later. They already did it to his wife, as I mentioned earlier. And yeah, I do think Ron Paul. I'm sad he couldn't be president, but as I said, ultimately, I definitely do think, if he for the presidency is mostly just a figurehead position. If he did actually get the presidency and actually try and enact libertarian reform, the deep state would have just taken him out, as I said earlier. Next, we have, this has been ruled illegal multiple times, but is now being ramped up, posted by FastyRuinous739, and that's crosspost from the Narco-Capitalism subreddit, and that looks like a video from Change.org. Government surveillance program tracks and detains U.S. citizens for suspicious travel, and then the OP added, the problem is taking a picture of your car or sharing the information. The problem is using the information to legally search your property. And ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it feels like doing when it comes to searching your property or spying on you, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's sadly how the world works. Since the government has legal monopoly use of force, oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. And you can try suing them, I guess, but they control the court system as well. So that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Bondi's hearing in Kangaroo Court called the U.S. federal government, posted by Otso the Lumberjack, and they said, if this shit show of nabbing can't convince people how worthless and dangerous and expensive federal government is, I don't know what will. Does anyone ever answer questions at those hearings? Everything is made up for TV garbage and doesn't solve problems or answer questions. These useless are letting Trump sue the federal government for $10 billion, so we're footing the bill for this nonsense. What do my reps even do? What is the purpose of my senators? I just want to give them a vote of no confidence, restrict their powers, the most narrowly defined powers possible. This is utterly shameful, and they are a waste of taxpayer dollars and time. Fuck them with the most splintered wooden dildo possible. And, I personally don't agree with all the stuff on the subreddit, but this is something I definitely agree with. I think, the federal government's just mostly just kind of like a high school, really. They just kind of circle jerk themselves and go over how great they are. Ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is, it's time to recognize that the federal government is inherently foul and unsalvageable point and gut it completely. I personally do feel sad that the founding fathers experiment has to come to an end. But at this point, it's pretty obvious that it's irreformable, especially since they can get around the Constitution and Bill of Rights whenever they want to justify it. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Trump's pick for top diplomatic role faces scrutiny over white supremacist views. Jeremy Carl, Assistant Secretary of State nominee, has espoused racist anti-Semitic views, says nonprofit leader from TheGuardian.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, if he wants to espouse those views, he should be able to. Of course, these days, if you send all the label, everything in the book, like racist, sexist, misogynist, if they want to throw out those labels, that's fine. Fascist, Nazi, Hitler, except for all whatever labels you want to. But when you keep throwing out those labels to anyone who dissents at all, ultimately it's just gonna be like crying wolf or Chicken Little going the sky is falling. Eventually people are gonna start toning it out, especially when it comes to anti-Semitic. Because Reddit, when it's when it's right coded, they'll say, "Oh, that's anti-Semitism," but when it's left coded, they'll just say that's anti-Zionism, and it just goes to show you that Reddit will always make an excuse when their side gets a bad label, but when the other side gets a bad label, they're going to say it's entirely justified. Next, we have Trump admin has spent more than $30 million deporting migrants to countries that were not their own. Democratic report says from CNN.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should be doing that. But the government has legal monopoly in these forces, justify doing whatever it wants to, and that's one of the negative consequences of it. Next, we have Trump says the U.S. will not approve solar or wind power projects from CNBC.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is when it comes to any energy source, you should be able to build whatever energy source you want to. If you want to build solar or wind power, I think you should be able to. I don't think the government should be telling you can't be able to do that, especially on your own property. But that being said, I don't think the U.S. government should be subsidizing any energy source, not solar or wind power or any other source of energy like coal, as I said earlier. But ultimately, if the government wants to justify subsidizing whatever wants to subsidize, oftentimes, as I said, there's nothing you can do about it. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.